Welcome to the ResponderStrong Mental Health Curriculum, brought to you by All Clear Foundation. All Clear Foundation is a national nonprofit that supports emergency responders and their family members in their overall well-being and longevity. Welcome to Section 2. We are talking about stress here, the physiology of stress and the stress-injury continuum for emergency responders. What is stress? Stress is an innate response in our bodies. It is our hardwired response to a threat, a perceived threat, or a challenge. So stress isn't always bad. We need stress to survive and to thrive in life. But the key thing in this phrasing is perceived threat, which I think is really interesting and something that a lot of people don't realize. Ever had the experience when you have had an argument or some other negative incident and you replay it over and over and over again in your mind, or a bad call, a bad patient outcome? Ever notice that you're having the same physiologic responses in your body that you did during the initial incident? Our brains and bodies don't differentiate from actually experiencing the event and replaying it in our mind. So many of us aren't aware that part of the reason we have such high stress loads is because we're inadvertently doing things that maintain that stress burden on our body. And again, stress isn't always bad. If we didn't have any stress, we wouldn't get out of bed in the morning. It's managing it appropriately that is really key in our work.
Yeah, I mean, stress is performative, right? So it's important to recognize how we are physiologically constructed to perform in stressful situations and how that historically has affected us and worked, and then how that affects us today in our sort of modern society where the realities that we face are very, very different than just 200 years ago, but we have similar physiology than we did that we did then. We're going to describe here, moving forward, how those differences affect us, and so we'll go look at this. One of the questions I love to ask is, in these pictures, which of these two animals is experiencing a stress response? And there's no one here, so there's no one going to answer the question. But both of these animals are experiencing a stress response, and they're both performative stress responses, and they're both challenged in trying to, one, eat and one, not be food. But this is the sort of structure of our physiologic stress response. This is the way we have evolved as mammals, is to have this sort of physiologic response when we have stimulus.
So when we talk from a physiologic perspective, there are a couple of things that happen in an acute stress reaction. And I love the way Brandon refers to it as performative. It is performative for us, and it is designed for us to protect us, to save our lives. So it was intended for situations like this. Our sympathetic nervous system gets activated, which causes a whole flood of responses. It sends blood to our peripheral muscles, takes it away from our digestive system, increases the tension in those muscles. The nervous system, sympathetic nervous system, is activated. Hormonally, we release a lot of adrenaline and we release a lot of cortisol. These are designed to allow us to have the fight, the flight, or the freeze response. In the case of a grizzly bear attack, freezing's a really good response to have. If you're a squirrel running out in traffic, freezing doesn't work so well. The thing is, we don't get to choose which one we go to. Our nervous system chooses whether we go to fight, flight, or freeze. The other big thing to know is that adrenaline can be tapped out relatively quickly. Cortisol can run high for a long time. We'll talk more about that. That chronically high levels of cortisol contribute to a lot of not only our mental and emotional challenges, but our cardiac, our metabolic, and then indirectly our social and our relational challenges. So the acute stress reaction is designed to save our lives. What our body does is diverts energy from the things that are not likely to save our lives in the moment to conserve fuel. And when we're talking about our brain, the prefrontal cortex, this area up here, the newest part of our brain, which is the executive center. So it's where empathy and compassion live. It's where understanding consequences, it's predictive ability. This is where we're our highest and best selves in most situations. It burns a lot of energy. And when we're in a highly stressed state, it starts to become less and less active, and we drop down to the mammalian and then the limbic systems of the brain. These are designed to be more emotive, to be more reactionary, to save our lives in the moment. If you hear a series of loud bangs, you don't want your prefrontal cortex jumping online to say, oh, I think I heard 4 or 5 loud bangs. I'm wondering, could those have been a backfire, fireworks, a gunfire? No, you want to react immediately to duck cover, go someplace safe, and assess the situation from there. The problem is when we're chronically stressed, we tend to drop into these lower functioning areas of the brain where we have less aptitude for capacity for empathy, for compassion, self-control, to understand the other's personal situation. And this is a place where we become very irritable, we become very reactive, we become more difficult to be around, and we become less logical. We are less able to think our way out of a situation.
I like to think of this as the difference between response and reaction. So, when you think about this, our brains are incredibly well designed for running from a tiger. I mean, just amazing. I heard a couple of weeks ago that we see like dogs smell. We get this stimulus, we have an incredible ability to respond, and we have this limbic reaction, right? So we immediately turn tail and run. We're ready to fight, whatever we're going to do to sort of deal with the situation. The challenge is I haven't seen a tiger in at least a couple of weeks, and we don't really often have this need. The need that we have is what I'll call logic and strategy, which happens in our prefrontal cortex, but we still have the same physiologic response. So I get negative stimulus that I don't like, it's a human resources problem or whatever. I have a limbic response, or what we'll call an amygdala hijack, where I just react. I don't have a lot of prefrontal cortex innervation because the stimulus actually goes faster to my limbic system than it does to my logic system. And I just say the thing that I know is the wrong thing, and I'm trying to grab it as it comes out, but I just can't. And that is the way our brains react to this negative stimulus. And it is not well adapted. It's not performative when we think about non-tiger running, being shot at sort of situations.
But the more time, as to bring to the positive, then not all stress is bad, the more time in our industry that we spend in some form of a like performative stress where we can train, we can kind of put some gross motor skills into practice, and that's when we build things within either, whether it's a policy, training, but we spend in that time, we're going to react in that time because we know that some of these things just then automatically get shut off, and when we're in that fight or flight mode or freeze, we're being fed what we need to be fed. But providing that ability or training even with some breathing, we're going to talk about some of those things that can slow some of the things that are physiologically happening in your body, is going to give you the ability to recognize more things before you react. So we try to talk about that performative or positive side, but we have to recognize under acute stress situations, these things are occurring.
Well, we know that these responses are intended to be adaptive, that we're in an acute period of stress. We need these stimuli, we need these reactions, but we need to come back to baseline. And that's one of the things that we haven't traditionally been good at as responders. Instead of rising to the challenge and coming back to baseline, rising to the next challenge, coming back to baseline, we tend to trend upward over time. And we don't realize it. We'll talk more about that later. Here we're really highlighting what a stress reaction does to our brains, but it impacts every system in our body, including digestive system. You don't need to digest in the moment of extreme stress or threat to your life. Think about how many responders have ulcers, reflux, IBS, other sorts of digestive system issues. It's believed it's because our system is shut offline quite a bit. Other things, we have a decreased immune response because in the moment of an immediate life threat, you're not going to die by virus or bacteria. It's something external, so our immune system gets tamped down. We hear so many responders and other people in high stress professions talking about, I'm just going to make it to vacation, cranking out all the shifts, all the extra work. They get on vacation, and what happens 2 to 3 days into it? They get sick. Because as they're shifting from that state of sympathetic nervous system activation into parasympathetic, rest, digest, recover, the immune system's coming back online and looking at all the cleaning up that it needs to do. Other things we see is that when we have a prolonged stress reaction, our inflammation system gets turned way up, and that can lead to not only challenges mentally and emotionally for us, but with blood clots, with cardiac disease, with hypertension, with obesity, the way we metabolize sugars. There are a whole host of systems that go offline under chronic stress. And this is why it's so important that we equip ourselves with the tools to have the awareness Craig just spoke about, to recognize when we're going off the chart, when we're more reactive than we need to be, and to bring ourselves back to that baseline so that the rest of our systems can come back online and we can keep functioning. We like to really talk about stress injury. We don't talk about mental illness. We talk about the overwhelm of our coping mechanisms, and that is what causes a lot of what we call depression, anxiety, substance misuse, anger issues, and other challenges that we see among emergency responders. And one of the things we really love about this model, we borrowed it from the military, this is the US Navy's version, is that once we understand these zones, we can begin to recognize in ourselves, what does this ready look like for me? What does it look like when I'm reacting? What does it look like when I'm injured? How do I bring myself back to those other stages? How can I better regulate and bring myself back to baseline so that I don't suffer the accumulation of the overwhelm of my coping mechanisms? And what coping mechanisms do I need to either adapt or to strengthen so that I am more resilient, more able to handle challenge?
In those first two that we talk about before we move on, in the ready and the reacting, clearly there's no timeline in any of this of how long you can remain in those stages, how you can move back in through this. And the next slide will kind of talk about that. But the premise of ready and reacting comes around being your own self-advocate. So some of the things you see there in staying mission ready, as they prefer to it, or recover and rebuild, is things that you need to advocate for yourself or put into practice in your life. They can be, if they become routine, then your likelihood of staying in those areas are much more successful.
I would say, I also, when I sort of first experienced this curriculum, one of the things that was really powerful that stuck with me was the difference between post-traumatic stress injury and post-traumatic stress disorder. And my career, I'd always sort of thought of PTSD as being this thing I couldn't possibly have because I don't have disorders. And that seemed very permanent to me. That seemed like something that, one couldn't recover from. And the idea somehow that, that there isn't an ability to recover from post-traumatic stress is a fallacy. And instead thinking about it through the lens of an injury. So thinking about being exposed to something, it's challenging, it leaves its mark, but then you can transcend it through care, is, I think, a much more kind of consumable and approachable model for thinking about how this stuff affects us. And I know we have talked about before, if you're at work and you hurt your back, you wouldn't be jettisoned from the career. Instead, someone would say, oh, you hurt your back, you're going to go to the physical therapist, we're going to give you some light duty, you're going to come back, you're going to be good as new. But we don't do that for people that experience post-traumatic stress injury. And so we need to change that paradigm as well. So we see all of those things are opportunities for us to seek care, heal, and then come back online.
We really love this depiction. It's the health and performance continuum from the Department of Homeland Security. And really, that's what we're about here, is how do we help responders maintain high performance, not only on the job, but in the rest of their life as well. We recognize that traditionally, responders have really paid for their service with their lives, either in longevity or in quality, and that's not necessary. One of the other big impacts or facets of our cultures that we've seen is that we've really glamorized martyrdom. And to Brandon's point earlier, about really glorifying the FTOs and the salty members of the profession who are really stress injured as being the ones who've achieved, who are accomplished, who have swagger. That's not true. That's stress injury. What we really want is to idolize healthy performance. And this is a great way to look at what it looks like when we're at peak performance and what to do, how to maintain it, like Craig spoke to. What it looks like, even more importantly, when we're starting to experience decreased performance and going down that downward spiral, because at any point we can self-arrest if, one, we recognize it, and two, we know what to do about it.
Acute stress. Well, I mean, we talked about this a bit, with how our, physiologically we're prepared to deal with the potential stressors of the old world. But essentially, these are the times when our physiologic stress system is performative. We experience something, and we need to then ramp up our physical ability to cope with it. And it could be, any of these sorts of things. One of the things that I always think about when I think about acute stress is how we as responders move into a place where we're sort of at an elevated level all the time and maybe don't feel these peaks and valleys, right? So you've been in your job for 5 or 10 years, you may not feel this peak anymore. You go on a call that used to really get your heart rate moving and you don't feel that, because it's not that you're not getting excited anymore, it's that you're always excited. And so it's really important for us to differentiate there and recognize, that we are sort of designed for this stuff. We're designed to be able to physiologically respond to these situations, but they're not as they're not as couched in the same way that they would have been when we were running from the tiger.
So think about a recent acute stress incident that you have experienced. It could be an argument with somebody, it could be an altercation, it could be a threat on the job. And think about, feel in your body, what did you feel in that moment?
And unfortunately, we can't make this job any less stressful. It's kind of built into what we all do in the profession, and we recognize that. Whether these moments of acute stress are peppered through your career, we know they have these effects, but also recognizing that if you're a coworker, you're a leader in one of these roles, how are people responding after acute situation? We know that it does a tremendous amount of stuff physiologically. Are they to the point of mission ready, they're capable of going back? Recognizing that we might need to pull them offline after an incident like that, because their performance is going to suffer, and their propensity for irritability, other things like that are going to play a part. It's really hard for us to come back down after an acute stress moment, although we become really tired, sleep's disrupted, other things like that. So we have to recognize that in our profession and put things around it that we can address it.
To paint this picture, you can imagine you get this sort of exposure, you get some sort of stressor that you're exposed to, and all of a sudden you feel the sweaty hands, you feel the elevated heart rate. You sort of stop seeing detail in what's happening around you, and you become hyper focused. We've all run the call right after we ate lunch, and all of a sudden after the call we have gastrointestinal problems because we stop, perfusing our GI system. All of these things are changing as we have this exposure, and that is that feeling of acute stress.
Absolutely. And in the situation where we are fending off an immediate life threat, those things are good. You want your hands to be clenched. You want your heart rate and your blood pressure to be up. You don't want to be digesting. You want as much blood as possible in your muscles. Those are all great. So they are adaptive in the moment for an immediate life stress. The problem is when we don't shut those down and they become chronic, they become very corrosive to our well-being.
I like to give an example, if it's okay. Yeah. When I was first on the job as a police officer, I got in my first foot pursuit, as you would call it, and I was running after an individual. And on any given day, had this not been in the job or anything else, along with my 25 pounds of gear that I was wearing, I came up upon a 6-foot fence, which the suspect went over. On any other given day, I would have labored over that and probably fallen on the other side on my butt. But in this given moment, I believe that I actually hurdled the fence. And that's the kind of stuff that is really an amazing thing when it happens under a situation like that. And it makes you perform at your very best to either save a life or do something that you didn't think you could normally do under circumstances.
The physiologic changes are incredible. So cortisol actually takes calcium out of your bones so that it can increase the contractility of your heart. So you have more blood flow but higher blood pressure. It is really amazing how your physiology changes so you can be physically performative.
Which is fantastic in the moment,
yes.
Not so good chronically because you can't sustain it without robbing other systems in your body, like bone density. So chronic stress, love this image. It's those stressors that take place over a longer span of time. It's the things that hit you all the time. It can be supervision by your FTO. It can be administrative oversight. It can be getting stuck in traffic time and time again until you get road rage. It can be relationship conflict in your station, in your workplace, or in your home. Just these things that never seem to let you get up, let you catch a breath.
I like to think of this as the stressful situations where you have the same feelings that you would in acute stress, but there isn't physical performance required, right? So you have all this physiologic change that's preparing you to run and fight and hide and all those sorts of things, but the reality is you never get to use any of that because it's going to take a test, it's going to have a conversation with human resources, it's all the things that get the flutters going, but you're not actually going to be performing.
And what's happening, because as Brandon alluded to, in many of those situations, you need to think your way out of the chronic stress. But when you're experiencing that stress reaction, those stress hormones and that sympathetic nervous system elevation, you're not in your logical state of mind. You are experiencing the physical impacts of that sympathetic nervous system stimulation. So maybe shaking, loss of fine motor skills, hands are clenched, sweaty, heart rate's up, blood pressure's up, and all of that is making you less effective in the moment. And oftentimes we don't recognize it. We start to think this is just the way that we are.
And it then contributes. So you're having the amygdala hijack, you're saying the thing that you haven't thought through, and you're having a conversation with your wife, and then the thing you say makes the situation worse, and we start to have this snowball effect. The reality is you have the ability to sort of manage some of that. It's as simple as pausing to let that signal get to your prefrontal cortex so you can have a little bit of logical response. But all of these things, we're just not adapted well for chronic stressful situations. And so we have to short circuit our general systems through education to be able to make better choices.
And we talk about chronic stress, and we talked earlier in slides that this ability or lack of ability to come off duty, right? The state of vigilance, and that's where this really lives. It might have depending on where it lives in your stress spectrum, you might feel some physical things, but the reality is there are physiological things happening, like we talked about, the release of cortisol, which we know to be one of the most deleterious things to health, not just autoimmune, but heart health. Cortisol is a known active plaque builder. It's estimated that first responders can build plaque about 3 times faster than the civilian population. Because if you think about it, we're living in moments of acute stress that are few and far between, but they happen. The chronic stress that everybody has, whether it's in family life, administrative, job related, but also, again, we speak about this state of vigilance. So we tend to live in a very stressful state the majority of our time.
Well, and to our point earlier, that stress reactions are a reaction to a threat or a perceived threat, perception is really key. And so often when we are in a more stressed state of mind, we start to ruminate more. The what ifs, we get angry, we get into that negative reactive state of the brain, and we don't realize that when we're replaying the negative event, we're replaying how it could have come out, we're replaying how somebody had wronged us, we're replaying what we think that we should do to them in the future. This is heightening our stress response and driving us to a more and more stressed place physiologically. And it is really, I think we've really done a disservice to our personnel and not letting them know that our body perceives so many external stimuli as stressors. So many times, to Brandon's point earlier, you're not calmer on calls, you just have a higher threshold for activation. You are living at a more activated state all the time, so you think you're not as stressed, but you're more stressed all the time. But to that point, when we leave work many times, we are still trying to meet that stimulation demand that we've become accustomed to. So look at how we try to relax. Action movies, horror flicks, things like that our nervous system is reacting to. We start to engage in more opinionated discourse with others because we're looking for that stimulation, and we're not really realizing why we feel so much chronic stress. A lot of it is what we're doing to ourselves.
And the take-home message here is we are not designed to be able to cope with this stuff well. And so we have to recognize it, and then we have to build sort of mechanisms to be able to circumvent some of the physiologic things that we do when we have stressor.
So the point, chronic stress reactions and acute stress reactions, it's the same physiologically. In acute stress reactions, say when your life is truly in danger or you really need to perform, you need to clear that 6-foot fence, perfect. That's really helping you. But you get all that same activation in chronic stress. And when it stays high over time, we get this whole stress response system reaction. We're more involved in our amygdalas. We're less involved in our prefrontal cortex. We are changing the amount of cortisol that we crank out, to Craig's point. And we're really impacting our bodies negatively over the long term. But we can control the chronic stress reaction. Love this analogy. It's a thought experiment, I hope, not a real one. Boiling frog syndrome. If you take a pot of water and you put it on the stove and you turn it up and it starts to boil, if you throw a frog in, the frog's gonna jump right out. It knows this is not a hospitable environment, I'm out of here. But what happens to us with chronic stress is more the situation if you took a pot of cold water, put a frog in it, frog's just chilling, life is good, you put it on the stove and you turn it to medium heat so it slowly heats up over time. Well, that frog will actually stay in the pot and boil to death because it doesn't realize the changes are so insidious, it doesn't realize that it's an inhospitable environment anymore. And I think that's a fantastic representation of what we encounter in the chronic stress of a career if it's unmitigated.
Yeah, this is the normalization of deviance, right? So it's incremental, and I think that, I mean, I have experienced this in leaving the frontline industry. So I've been at a desk now for 10 years, and when I got my desk for the first time, I went through a transition where I started to actually feel things again. And the example that I always use is I was almost hit on the interstate, and I had this like immense response that I couldn't understand, and I pulled over and called my wife, and she said, well, yeah, you almost got in an accident. And I said, I haven't felt that. I've been running EMS calls for 15 years, and I haven't felt that in a decade. And it's not because I'm some sort of smooth actor. It's because I was way up here all the time, so I didn't feel peak and I didn't feel valley. And until I got out of the response industry, essentially, and started doing something completely different, that I actually started feeling peaks and valleys and recognized that I was having normalization. And so it's important to recognize if you are kind of in a response capacity all the time, you may think that you're okay, but you're the frog in the really hot water because you just don't have the ability to have that perception.
We've talked about performance and we've talked about stress. We do need a certain amount of stress to do everything in life. The thing is, we need to have the appropriate amount of stress reaction for the task at hand. Like Brandon said, lots of times we're pegging it, we're in the red zone, and we really just need a much lower level of stress to perform appropriately in the moment. So being under-aroused for the situation or over-aroused lead to a decrease in performance.
So yeah, here's our all the things that we sort of are challenged by. And you know, we always talk about this. We know that it's incredibly challenging to do our jobs. We know it's incredibly challenging to run calls. I think that most of us, though, would admit that, you know, this is probably not the stuff that we're ruminating on a regular basis. It is more the sort of challenges that exist in us just having a relationship with our employer, and then all of the challenges that we face in life. And the question is, you know, how do you build a platform so that you can be resilient, so that you can cope with this stuff when it becomes really challenging, but also be present and capable in the other two scenarios?
Yeah, and to kind of paint a bigger picture in this and put it into context, because I don't want it to be lesser than it should be. And what I mean by that is that we know this is not a fatalist industry. We know there's a lot of things that occur in our industry that are challenging, that can be traumatic, but the reality when it comes to stress, to paint a picture, our average life expectancy in a first responder is 22 years less than the civilian population. And a lot of it starts right here at stress. And if we don't understand the impact it can have, the forms of stress that are present in our job in particular, and then we factor in some of the things we've already talked about, whether it's lack of sleep, poor eating habits, whatever it may be, we're just building this significant issue and epidemic amongst first responders where we start to see this have a big impact. But in my opinion, it really starts here in learning how to manage this and understand stress and the impact.
And pretty consistently, responders will rate administrative stressors in particular much higher than operational stressors. One, because when we're operational, when we're engaging with the patient, we're out in the rescue, we're out in the field, we're responding to the call, we have the capacity to do something. We have personal agency, which is a really protective factor. It's even more protective when we're in a high-performing state, when we are emotionally aroused, sympathetically, nervous system aroused to the appropriate amount for that situation. That is a very protective factor for us against the stress injuries of the job. When we're talking about administrative stressors, though, lots of times that's where we feel mistreated, disempowered, a victim of the system. No good deed goes unpunished is one of the statements that I've heard over my career. More recently, over the past few years, we look at the nursing profession in particular and administrative betrayal. So many nurses are flooding out of the system, and these are people who are passionate about caring for others, about caring for their community, just leaving because of burnout. Last year, I think it was more than 126,000 nurses didn't just leave their facility to go to another facility, they left the nursing profession overall. And one of the big things that was cited as a reason is administrative betrayal, that nurses worked through COVID, didn't take vacation, worked long hours, and many times self-isolated from their families out of fear of their own personal safety and bringing something home to their family members. They gave all they had and asked for raises, and many times hospital systems said, we can't give you a raise, we don't have that money. Then they brought in traveling nurses who are making 3 to 4 times as much as the standard nurses. What a sense of betrayal. Nurses were encountering demoralization, and that really contributed to the way that they perceived their profession and their own level of stress. One of the big points on that is not to be negative, but it's to recognize we have to take care of ourselves internally, but sometimes it is a systemic issue. And when we are taking care of ourselves internally, when we're in a state of high performance, we're going to be more effective in changing that systemic issue. To Brandon's point earlier, having leaders who maintain good direct contact with the field providers, the line level providers, and understand what their challenges are, and are willing to acknowledge their own challenges over the course of their career, this can create some common ground where policy changes can be made, where morale can be boosted, and for leaders, where recruiting and retention can be improved. We're seeing that as a problem across the fields, particularly law enforcement, EMS, and healthcare providers.
Yeah, whenever I see this slide, I think immediately, this is where we have perceived control. I wouldn't say we have control. But we have a perception of control, and the administrative side is where we have probably the least influence. And so that's how I see this spectrum. We have some perception of control at home. We have a huge perception of control on the street, but the administrative side, we have none. And if you're an administrator or a leader, your job, in my estimation, is to remove the barriers for your employees to be able to do the things that they're passionate about. And if you can kind of achieve that goal, you can significantly reduce the administrative stress. I'd like to stand on a soapbox here. Let me stand on a small soapbox. Stress in the seat. We think about dispatchers, and we don't often sort of talk about dispatch and how challenging dispatch is from a exposure to trauma standpoint, because they're not there and they don't actually see the things. But it's important for us to recognize that they not only hear the things, they have a less ability to feel like they have control. But the thing that we do as humans when we hear about a challenging situation is create a visualization. And so we don't just create, we don't think about it and create the simplest and kind of easiest visualization. We create the most challenging visualization and have a very similar level of exposure to trauma. And so my soapbox is, when you're going on these calls that are really challenging, and you know that the call came in and it was completely different than the outcome, call the dispatcher and just let them know, hey, we went in, I know that it was really challenging to hear that, but this is what ended up happening. It really wasn't the same thing that we thought it was originally. Give them some closure in that situation, because that will help them a lot from their stress exposure standpoint.
And one thing, whether it's one of the ones we don't have control on, but it's unique to our environment in this day and age, is the importance that we must have in transparency with the public, how we do things. But with technology and invention, sometimes these things that can be exposed, or the transparency side of what we do on a call or certain things like that, is an immediate thing that the public has access to. And to not put context or understanding around some of those things can create a tremendous amount of stress, because it's not in our control.
Exactly. Well, and back to Brandon's point about the dispatchers, we recognize that the dispatch role is sedentary by nature. You're either standing at a console or sitting in a chair. But dispatchers listening to everything are flooded with all of the same acute stress responses everybody in the field or in the hospital are. They just have fewer outlets to expend those. So they have to stay stationary. They're experiencing the elevated heart rate, the blood pressure. To Brandon's point, they're trying to get closure. They're trying to fill in the gaps with what they're hearing, which is an issue in its own right. The rest of us can engage through all of our senses. Dispatchers can only speak and listen. All emergency responders, all humans, have a negativity bias. It's part of our hardwired system to survive. If you're out skipping along a trail and you don't notice a daisy, big deal, it's a flower, there's going to be more. If you don't notice a rattlesnake, well, that could potentially be a fatal outcome. So all humans have a negativity bias. We're trained to scan our environment for what could hurt us or be a threat. What does emergency response work do? It hones that bias to a fine edge. None of us go into a patient's room or to a call or to a scene looking for design ideas, things we're grateful for. We're looking for what happened, what could go wrong, and how are we going to prevent it. And that's exactly the mindset dispatchers are in when they're listening to the call and trying to engage. So when they're filling in the gaps between the shots, the screams, the shouts, they're not going with good stuff, the most positive outcome. They're going for what is the worst thing that could happen. And that goes down that path of rumination. They're replaying the call in their mind, because all of us want to make sense of what we encounter in our life, and they're trying to make sense in a vacuum. So not only are they flooded with these hormones and this nervous system response that they can't do much about, they're going down negative places. Many times when we're frustrated in the field, we take it out on dispatch because we think we got the wrong information, they're not there, they're not in person. And that can cause another layer of wounding to the dispatchers. So the other big thing to think about with dispatchers is they go through all the stress of a call, As soon as they hang up off that one, they got to get on another one. It might be something just as severe, just as critical, or it might be a neighbor complaining about somebody's dog barking, and they have to respond professionally and they have to stay in their prefrontal cortex, regardless what the nature of the call is. And just think how that can accumulate not only over a shift, but over a set, over a week, over a career. And some of the ways that we can really engage with them as field responders is to bring them into the circle, include them in defusings and debriefings, call them, thank them for their help, fill in the blanks, like Brandon said. We can do a tremendous amount to help dispatchers who oftentimes feel like they are kind of the stepchild of the emergency response system. They're not included in the field. They're often excluded from our supports. And the other big thing is there's a lot of talk around vicarious and secondary trauma. And I think sometimes people view that as an estimation of how impactful it is. It isn't. It's the route of exposure. Just because you heard something doesn't make it any less impactful than having seen it or witnessed it or engaged in it. Secondary and vicarious trauma are just descriptions of the route that somebody was exposed to stressors and trauma. It is not a measure of the validity or the intensity of that exposure. Other big thing, administrative stress, that can carry over to policies outside of our agencies. And in particular, I'm thinking about pilots, air medical pilots and wildland pilots. Many times feel like they can't reach out for help because of FAA regulations. When they go through their recertification, their licensure as a pilot, there is a line, item 18, in the physical that asks, have you been diagnosed with a mental health problem? That asks if you're taking any medication. There's some latitude around the SSRIs, Celexa, Lexapro, a couple of others, but pilots are terrified, going back to the sense of identity. If I trigger that, if the FAA thinks I'm not safe to fly, they're going to take my license, I'm going to lose my livelihood, I'm going to lose my identity. And the messages we have for pilots are, that does not happen very often. It's usually a very extreme circumstance, and there are ways to work around that. Reaching out proactively for mental health support, emotional health support is key. Take care of the issue in the early stages. 2, work with somebody who's culturally competent and trauma informed so that they will know, hey, if I have to give you a diagnosis, it's going to be something around stress. You need help with stress management. You need help with sleep, something like that, not depression, not anxiety. That's somebody who understands the way the FAA system works. But again, really knowing yourself and being able to reach out when you're starting to notice signs of injury is key. Working with somebody who's culturally competent to help you navigate the system while getting the support you need, regardless what state you're in, is also very essential.
Yeah, and that's another reason that we need to move our culture away from persecuting people that have these experiences, because we all have sort of had that same fear that if I bring forth this feeling that I'm having or this challenge, I'm going to lose the chance of having the promotion. I'm going to be shunned from my coworkers. It's just a cultural change that we have to make, and it's sad that the FAA is still there. But as a response community, we just have to completely 180-degree turn away from those sorts of thoughts.
And the stress at home piece. I mean, every citizen has stress at home. Oftentimes, emergency response work can compound those stressors by piling additional challenges on top of it. Think about people who deploy seasonally or who deploy for specific events. So disaster workers, FEMA responders, hurricanes, tornadoes, wildland firefighters. These are people who have home life, get ripped out of it, usually suddenly, get completely immersed in their environment, may not be able to be in contact with their family members the way they would like to be. This shifts the burden to the partner, to the kids to take care of themselves, to manage issues, and it can lead to a fragmenting of the relationship. You're missing holidays, you're missing special events, you feel like you're not understood, your family doesn't understand what you do. Conversely, your family feels like you've forgotten what they do and how important they are. To Craig's point about first and second families, families can oftentimes feel like they are not as highly regarded in your world as your coworkers when you're in these intense situations. So it can be a whole nother layer of challenge depending on what role you serve in the emergency response professions. Activity.
Get my glasses.
Oh, let's see.
Bottles. Here we go. Drink some coffee. So the analogy here is pretty simple, but what we want you to do there at your desk is grab a water bottle, or a coffee mug or whatever, and hold your hand out and sort of try to support that weight. And ask yourself, how much does this thing really weigh? I have this great coffee mug that probably weighs like 10 ounces or something. I could lift this very easily. I'm a very strong person. But the question is, how does this impact your ability to hold this over time? Right? So the analogy here is, how do things affect you over time? Is it linear, or is it something that gets more and more challenging as you hold this? And if I stood here for an hour and we talked about the merits of my coffee cup, how would you feel at the end of that hour? Would your bicep hurt? Would your shoulder hurt? Would you be able to hold this for that length of time? And I would say that this is going to get more and more intense and more challenging, even though it's the same weight. This analogy then exists in parallel with the sort of trauma and experiences that we have on a daily basis, right? So those things weigh on us as we experience them, and we have to live with them over and over again for time without getting care. And so the hope is that you recognize that this is now getting too hard for me to do anymore, and I'm going to hurt myself. But the hope is that you recognize that this is the weight that we feel with this chronic stress on a regular basis, and how can we alleviate having to hold this up and start taking things off of our plate so that we can get to a place where we're not affected by it in the same way.
So it's not about the weight of any specific event itself, it's about how long we choose to carry it. And I love the analogy that responders tend to wear a backpack and they pick up other people's rocks and put them in the pack out of public service, out of good reasons. Well, the pack isn't that heavy, each rock isn't that heavy, but over time, as you carry it further and further and further, it becomes debilitating. The trick is to deal with it before it accumulates, to put it down, which is something we're not good at. All right, post-traumatic stress injury. As Brandon discussed earlier, we really like the transition from post-traumatic stress disorder to injury. It is an injury, it is recoverable, just like any physical injury on the job. It is not a disorder. It is a normal protective stress reaction that continues beyond the event itself.
It's important for us to recognize this because, as we sort of discussed, with proper care and recognition, one can transcend this and heal and get back to full duty without any sort of significant downsides. I think that's a big sea change shift from the way we used to perceive this, which was, if you can't deal with this stuff, then you're just not cut out for this industry, and that's just not the case.
And we know that the PTSI estimates range between 7 to 27%. The variety of range in estimation has a lot to do with underreporting, the repositories to collect data and the information around that. So that's why you see such a broad range. But I think estimates are as high as possibly even like 50, 60% in some capacities.
And that's in large part due to the expansion of the definition, that post-traumatic stress injury can cover a whole spectrum of symptoms, which is part of the reason why we think it's so underreported, is a lot of these symptoms are attributed to other causes and not recognized in the moment. There's also the shame aspect, the feeling of weakness, although that's mistaken, keeping people quiet about their struggles, and we'll see some demonstrations of that coming up. This quote we really love: the expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. And I think that's exactly what all of the response professions, whether you're in the hospital or out in the field or on deployment, you expect yourself, and we've expected each other, just to be immersed in all of these horrible things and just to deal with it. Suck it up, buttercup. If you can't handle it, you're weak. And that's not true. We've really fallen short in equipping people with the awareness and the tools to protect themselves throughout their career. As Craig mentioned earlier, this career is not a death sentence. There are exposures that we just need to train for. Just like if you want to increase strength, you need to go to the gym on a regular basis and train for that. This job is very demanding, and having emotional and mental wellness training is essential for longevity and sustainability.
I can't tell you how many times I've had a conversation with somebody and they say, yeah, no, I understand that they're having a tough time. I'm fine. I'm kind of built different. And that is a misperception. The reality is you're being affected whether you sort of experience it or whether maybe you have been affected for such a long time that you don't see the change anymore. But this idea that there are just certain people that are cut out to do this and they can transcend this challenge without any effects is incorrect. And we have to, as leaders especially, start building our culture towards recognizing that this is an acceptable way of dealing with these things, and those people who say that they're just built different probably need as much help as anyone else.
We talk about the whole spectrum of post-traumatic stress injury, and these are some of the ways, not all of them, that post-traumatic stress injury can manifest. Intrusive thoughts, avoiding a scene, avoiding a type of person, avoiding a situation. Negative changes in thinking and mood. We've talked about how we all have a negativity bias. It's part of our survival mechanisms, but in the emergency response world, we're trained to look more directly at the negative, we're trained to predict it, and oftentimes when we start getting into the downward spiral of stress injury, we drop into increasing negativity. We can't see the good in anything, and it becomes a self-fulfilling or a self-perpetuating worldview.
Yeah, and I mean, I like to look at this list and then cross-reference it with the way I thought about people that were the people I idolized in the beginning of my career. You know, these folks that are sort of too cool for school, they're negative all the time, they engage their sort of coworkers in calls in a completely different way, without empathy, with judgment of patients or judgment of the individuals that they're interacting with. That's not symptoms of being a cool, experienced provider. That's PTSI.
And you can experience any one of these symptoms at one time. I mean, it doesn't have to be one or the other kind of scenario. You could be, you know, in different times and different moods where all these things can be affected.
So we will be showing 2 brief video clips that really talk about post-traumatic stress injury, not only its evolution, but its presentation, and they highlight why sometimes it's really difficult for the individual who's experiencing it and those around them to identify what's happening. So this first clip, Beyond the Call, is a full-length documentary. This is a small segment taken from Ontario, Canada, and we'll start that right now.
Post-traumatic stress disorder is an anxiety disorder that usually develops after an individual has experienced a traumatic event. One of the major problems is that when people are involved in critical incidents, it may be their job to be dealing all the time with critical events, traumatic events that to other people would seem completely overwhelming. They are expected to deal with every day. And because that's part of their job description, it's very difficult for people to say, I think I've had enough. I have reached my limit.
It's not just the firefighting division that deals with these stressors, that our communications division as well, as they're the initial call takers, and a lot of times they're on the phone with the victims, they're hearing things, and they don't have the ability to visualize or to have a conclusion that we are allowed to witness. There are also some stressors in fire prevention that they have to deal with, as can be in training if there's ever accidents on the training ground. So it's important that we remember it's not just the firefighting division, but all of our divisions can experience these types of incidents, and that there is support for all of them out there.
They're not sleeping at night. They're not getting good rest. They're becoming agitated, jumpy. Sometimes they become angry, irritable, as anyone would be when they haven't had good sleep. They may also lose their appetite or eat too much. People sometimes try to medicate themselves with alcohol or drugs. Some people will overeat. Some people will overwork. They may notice a deterioration in their relationships, and they may also notice a deterioration in their ability to focus, function at their job, even if they've been working at the same job for years.
Unfortunately, a lot of guys self-medicated with booze. That was what was available. It was sort of socially acceptable or whatever, you know. So if you had a bad call over the course of your shift, a lot of times guys would go for drinks afterwards, and you knew they were drinking more than they normally would or acting inappropriately. It was, now I would recognize it as a stress reaction to the call they'd been on.
I had no patience whatsoever, and I could fly off the handle at my kids or my wife over the simplest, silliest instances, but they didn't understand. Sleeping patterns completely disrupted, where I've not been able to sleep because I can't turn my brain off when I put my head on the pillow.
It's a lot of dark moments, a lot of lost sleep, some nightmares, a lot of thinking, like I say, and some drinking, and, you know, curtness. You lose your temper faster and you don't know why. Well, it's probably because you're stressed because of the situation that you were involved in, but you just didn't have an outlet to or the knowledge to know how to fix yourself.
All right, you had an opportunity to view that clip. What are some of the things that stood out to you, aside from the on-point facial hair that all the firefighters had? But what are some of the other things?
I'm sorry.
So one of the firefighters, the engineer, talked about how he was just angry and frustrated all the time. That's that enhanced negativity bias, that emotional reactivity. And where did he take it out? At home. His wife, his kids, his dog. And to Brandon's point, that early on in the evolution of emergency response professions, that was kind of seen as a badge of honor. Having relationship issues, grumbling about home life, but it really is a sign of stress injury. Another firefighter mentioned that after a horrible call, they'd go out for drinks in the morning. There's a red flag.
Right.
And
Using alcohol to cope is what I think, yeah.
exactly. And he talked about, you know, everybody knew that this guy was drinking more than he should usually or would usually, that he was being impacted. But he talked about nobody knew what to do. They all recognized it, but nobody felt empowered.
An enhanced temper, I think it was a short temper, one of the individuals mentioned as well.
And all of them recognizing that, I really love the quote, there was a lot of thinking and some drinking. It's interesting to see that when you sit down and talk with seasoned responders, that everybody's recognized they just didn't have the knowledge of the skills or the ways to help each other. And I love how the video wrapped up talking about the resources, to your point earlier, that the agency, their agency offers so that this suffering can be mitigated. This sets us up for another clip. This one is from OC 87. About a police officer, Rob, his personal struggle with post-traumatic stress. Again, identifying what it was, overcoming his own stigma and shame around it, and his eventual return to work.
I mean, every day is different in police work. You never know what that next call is going to be. It could be a cat up a tree, it could be a man with a gun, you just never know. It's an adrenaline rush, but you have to keep it in check. It's a lot, and your family does suffer sometimes. So I continued to say, show me your hands, and in one motion, turned, wheeled, and raised the gun. At that point, we exchanged gunfire, and I realized that I had been shot. I spent one night in the hospital. They ran a bunch of tests. I had to see our police psychologist to get cleared for work. Well, you kind of get the blessing, yep, you're good to go. And everything seemed fine, you know, it's kind of like get back on that horse. I knew something at that point was starting. I had headaches, didn't know why, thought maybe it was just stress. I started to have flashbacks of that muzzle flash, that ball of fire from 10 feet. And I would wake up at 3, 4 in the morning and I couldn't go back to sleep. I'd wake up soaked in sweat. I would pace the house at 3 in the morning. I'd see the trash men coming at 4. It was like I was almost afraid to go back to sleep for fear of getting back into that nightmare. And I wasn't putting it all together as stemming from that incident. You know, as cops, we're supposed to be strong. We internalize it and we don't talk about it, and it builds up inside. So once I realized that I needed to take some time and figure out and get my head back together and fix my head. I never had given that a thought. You have all these military vets in our department that saw battle and saw time, and they're all fine. And here I am struggling. I just got shot in the leg. It wasn't like anything crazy like these guys have experienced. It was humbling and embarrassing. And I said I would do whatever it took. And I did. I never stopped the treatments because I was still having the symptoms. Yeah, I was able to you know, better handle it and deal with it, but the symptoms were still there. We just kind of did baby steps, and I gradually increased my time at work, and next thing I knew, I was back full time. At one point, and I don't know when it was, I started to realize the night terrors were gone. The muzzle flash was gone. The irritability, the anxiety had diminished. And I don't think it was until I went back to work and got back into the everyday routine of being a cop again that the symptoms subsided. Sometimes it takes hitting that rock bottom, and you just hope that rock bottom isn't a bad situation. We put guys out all the time for whatever injuries they have, and they're out until they're better. And we accept that. But the mental health aspect of our job is something that we need to focus more on. I'm not a big public speaker, but in this case, I don't mind sharing. You know, for me, it is therapy in itself, just talking about it. And it does make me feel good that I can be a success story, to be able to, you know, tell somebody that it is possible to get through this. That's the story that I want to share with people.
Great, you had an opportunity to view that clip. What are some of the things that stood out? For me, it was how long from the incident that triggered the post-traumatic stress injury and Rob's recognition of the symptoms. If you recall, it was 2 years, and that's one of the reasons why it's so underreported. It's not immediate cause and effect. It can be separated by days, weeks, months, or even years. And when the onset happened for him, he attributed it to everything: stress, just not sleeping well, other challenges. He didn't identify that it was post-traumatic stress injury. And another really damaging thing that he manifested that a lot of responders do is comparative suffering.
Yes.
Did you hear him talk about, you know, there's a lot of guys on the job and girls on the job who are combat vets. They saw combat. I just got shot. How crazy, right? You never say that to somebody else, but that was his internal dialogue.
Yeah, and the progression of his intrusive thoughts became night terrors and actual nightmares that really didn't resolve until he was back on the job years later, and he started to notice those things weren't occurring. He wasn't having the nightmares or anything like that, which was speaking to him recovering.
I really appreciate that he was skeptical initially of the diagnosis and the challenge, but once he embraced the process of being cared for and healing, that he was able to transcend that and get back to a place where he was fully functional. And I would suggest not just as functional as he was before, but now not only functional in that previous way, but also now truly understanding how one can be impacted and then heal from post-traumatic stress.
Well, and following up on Craig's comment, this is another reason why it's really important when seeking mental and emotional health support and treatment that you go with a culturally competent provider. As Rob said, the only time when he realized he was fully healed was when he did return to the job. So he got a sense of identity, meaning, and purpose back. He had the camaraderie. He had the support mechanisms that were embedded in his agency. And that really was the final closure of that loop for him to heal. In the past, and oftentimes with clinicians who don't understand the responder psychology or the occupation itself, the advice has been, no, you can't go back there. That's where you got injured. You need to avoid that. That's not necessarily true. There are some people who are injured to the state that it's probably better for them to go somewhere else, but the vast majority of responders can return to work after seeking the appropriate treatment.
One of the things that was particularly impacting, the first time I ever saw that video of Rob, this is what sort of came to mind. Rob had this kind of pivotal event. I'm sure he had a lot of other events that contributed, but he had this sort of pivotal event that caused him to slide into this post-traumatic stress injury realm. I had the same exact intrusive thoughts, dreams, multiple times a night about 4 years into my career as a paramedic in New Orleans, but I never had a pivotal event. I didn't get shot. I didn't have, one, but it was a cumulative, multiple sort of exposures to tragedy and trauma over the course of that 4 years that brought me to the place where I had similar symptoms. So it doesn't have to be, gosh, I had the one horrible call. It can just be a cumulative, bad year, bad couple months that can put you in a place where you start to see symptoms.
And the interesting point about the cumulative stuff is it doesn't accumulate if you're able to manage it, if your coping mechanisms are sufficient in the moment. If you're so busy that you're focused on your job, your family, or other things, and you're not really taking care of yourself, that's really a disservice to yourself. In this profession, you need to keep pace with the mental and emotional demands, just like you do the physical demands.
And some of the things that we see, we may hear, we may experience, we may smell, whatever it may be, those can impact people in a different way. And like Rob said, it's or Brandon had mentioned, these cumulative things that can happen over time, or they could be the one call that maybe for you or the person you're standing next to might not have the same impact.
No two responders will be impacted by the same call. And there is a reason for this, and it's not weakness, which is what we've attributed it to in the past, or lack of experience, or time to retire, all of those things. We all get triggered, and the triggers are what cause us to have an outsized reaction to a call. And those triggers are basically connectors to past emotional moments. It can be that this call reminds us of a similar past call, a family member or a friend. I think we all know responders, nurses, doctors, who have treated somebody or responded to somebody who looks like their child or who looks like their significant other. And that just hits differently. It bypasses the logical mind, the emotional brain really kicks in. It can remind us of ourselves. I remember, because 911 calls run in series, and I was on a crew with 4 guys who were in their late 40s. We just had a series of calls over 2 or 3 sets, mid-40 something males, sudden cardiac death. We would respond to their home, attempt to work, occasionally transport, but then have to turn around and tell the spouse and the children that he was gone. There was nothing we could do about it. And I noticed over those 2 sets that my crew members were quieter and quieter. There wasn't the joking at the dinner table. There wasn't the laughter. There wasn't the excitement when the tones went off, and we finally had a conversation about it. And each one of them said, that could have been me. That could have been my wife and kids. It just started to bring their own mortality to mind, front and center, in some pretty horrific ways. It can also remind us of a previous emotional experience. In particular, we know about 30% of the emergency response population are current or former military. And many of those military members bring in prior combat experience or other experience from the military that has set them up with pre-existing stress injuries and now put them into a very trigger-rich environment. And that can be a trigger on a call that is seemingly unrelated.
A general tool for empathy in communications is to recognize that we all see the world through the lens of our previous experiences. So no 2 people are going to have the same reaction because no 2 people have the same historic experiences. And so when you're trying to be empathetic and understand how not to judge other people and navigate those situations, recognize that the way you're seeing that, the smells, that what you're seeing, what you're hearing, is not being interpreted by your brain in the same way as it is being interpreted by theirs, because you just don't have the same experience in life.
And lastly, I mean, what we see and what we do in our job and in a career, there's a reason. It has nothing to do with the strength and weakness of our mental capacity. These things are hard to comprehend, hard to process. They get stuck in places in our brain that we can't really move through or pass. So we have to get the help we need and the support we need to understand that. It has nothing to do, as Rhonda said, the stresses with strength or weakness.
Well, and ironically, in the past, a lot of us have tried to bury our negative experiences, either shoving them into that compartment behind us we don't want to deal with, or finding some other ways to ignore them. But what we're essentially doing is planting triggers in the form of mines in a minefield that we're living in. When we deal with them, we're not planting the mines, so we can move forward with fewer and fewer triggers. The other last thing to say about this is triggers can happen retroactively. Case in point, I know so many responders who felt that pediatric calls didn't really bother them. They were sad for the child, but it didn't really bother them. They dealt with it until they had their own child. And now they have a different connection to those calls, not only moving forward, but they can also be triggered for the calls in the past that they thought they dealt with. And this can happen for all of us in a variety of different call types. So just be aware, like Craig said, it's not weakness. There's a trigger. A trigger is a point to something that we need to manage. Paul Combs, love his cartoons, yeah. So what are the barriers to seeking help? We know what to do for others. Why do we have such a hard time for ourselves?
I mean, we've touched on this throughout the whole curriculum, but we talk about our culture and how it's challenged in us having the safety and support that we need to be able to express the challenges that we face when we're exposed to trauma. And I would suggest those of you that are in leadership, We have to, from the top of organizations, start significantly moving that culture. And the first step with that is recognizing where we fit into the challenge that exists in acceptance and caring for ourselves. So to the extent that you can, start moving yourself in the direction of recognition in your own challenges over the course of your career.
It's been said that trauma in PTSI is in itself a self-hiding disease, right? I mean, it's our own condition of oneself to kind of put these things off to the side, whether it's fear of cultural backlash, stigma, whatever it may be. It's something we do sometimes to ourselves, not seeking that help.
And all of this ties back in with Thomas Joyner's work around that thwarted sense of belongingness and that perceived sense of burdensomeness. Shame is deeply interwoven in that. And it comes partially from our culture, but also partially from our own self-perception and our internalization of that messaging. The great thing is we created this culture, intentionally or not, so we're also empowered to change it. Asking for help. We've touched on this, and Craig spoke eloquently about the need to create resources within our agency, and then not only to have them created so that they're listed in a random directory off on a computer hard drive, but to have them integrated into our agency, to have some relationship with our critical incident responders, to have a relationship with the mental health providers who are available to us, to have some engagement with proactive, empowering education like this, so that when somebody is in crisis, they know how to access the resources, or they know who to access who can help them.
Yeah, you should never be opening a binder for the first time when you're dealing with a crisis situation. You need to have multiple and redundant people in your organization that know the process, that know where to get access to help, and you need to have multiple pathways for people that are challenged to be able to engage that process. If there's any single point of failure, that's a challenging system.
Again, we've talked a lot about the importance of going to a licensed mental health professional who understands your occupation, who understands the exposure to trauma that you get, and who understands some of these challenges that are common among our profession, so that they can better engage with you and help you.
And we even speak about, even though it's a little off cuff, is the humor that we tend to possess in this industry. We use that as a coping mechanism, but having that person that's sitting across from you understand that that's part of our culture sometimes, and how we cope with things or normalize.
Rather than viewing it as a character flaw.
Correct.
Okay. So also, one of the great things to look for is clinicians who are willing to engage your family members, your significant other, in therapy when appropriate. We've all seen people who go and everything is all fine, say in a residential treatment program. They've changed, but they come home and their environment hasn't changed. So this is an opportunity to really facilitate increased understanding, awareness, and communication between the responder and the responder's family for creating a healthier home environment, which is where most of our recovery happens. Barriers. And this is something we've all been focused on through All Clear Foundation. We recognize there's 3 big barriers. One is geographic. Especially in small and rural communities, there may not be a mental health provider, a treatment facility, a peer support team, things that can be utilized for support. Another, and a big one, is financial. A lot of responders do not have the expendable income to take care of their mental health when they've been stress injured. Many responders don't have an EAP program or insurance coverage to help them with that. To both of those ends, we've really been working to create resources like this that are available in person or remotely to remove the geographic barrier. Everything we provide is free because we don't believe that a responder should have to pay to recover from the impacts of the job. And then the other barrier is that internal stigma. That's probably the biggest one, actually, that responders won't reach out because they're telling themselves that they're weak, they failed, they're just not strong enough for this. And this is the whole purpose of this, and our other free tools, ResponderStrong and others, are really to normalize that we're having very human reactions to some pretty abnormal experiences. Think about any given month in your career. Chances are you've seen more trauma, you've waded through more water than most people do over the course of their lives. And you're expecting yourself just to be able to handle that without any additional training or support.
In some, obviously, communities where it's more rural or isolated, Because it's the same for everyone, we value confidentiality and separation from the job. If we are, limited to maybe our EAP provider, some of those EAP providers could also be the same people that respond to you with you and aside as a peer on calls. And that might not be a comfortable relationship. So having the opportunity to seek out other resources is extremely valuable.
And one of the nice things to come out of COVID is the normalization of telehealth for therapy delivery for mental health challenges. Now, you don't necessarily have to find a clinician who lives in your community. You can go to somebody who's licensed in your state or in a state that has a compact agreement with yours. So it really expands not only the accessibility, but the number and the quality of the resources available. Substance misuse. And please note, we use the term misuse. We don't use abuse. And the reason we don't is because many times this is just a failed attempt to cope with trauma. This is a responder trying to find some respite, trying to find some room to breathe, and trying to numb out what the pain that they're feeling without realizing what the long-term negative consequences are.
And it tends to come in form of a dissociative anesthetic, some form of alcohol, other things like that, because we're literally trying to disassociate ourselves from that feeling, that experience, provide some numbness, anything like that. So that's where we see the abuse. And or the misuse, I should say. It's also okay to recognize that some of these things end up starting out of just the unintended consequence of an injury on the job. We tend to suffer a lot of biomechanical injuries, whether it's knees, backs, shoulders. These things are maybe prescribed in a way that's for recovery, but then begin to have long-term use and misuse.
Well, and I love that Craig brings that up. In the emergency response world, whether you're in the hospital or out in the field, it has not in the past been okay to talk about heart pain or soul pain. But to Craig's point, you blow your shoulder out, you go to work comp, you get a narcotic prescription. Now not only does your shoulder feel better, your heart and your soul feel better. And how much does that heighten the risk for dependency or misuse of that substance when that's the only outlet you have for that internal pain? And now we see, especially in healthcare fields and EMS, fire-based EMS, where a narc box is accessible, when the prescription gets cut off, which it eventually will, it can be really, really tempting to start diverting drugs to meet that need. Law enforcement, unfortunately, we see it in when they respond to a home and ask to use the restroom and maybe search the medicine cabinet. There are just a lot of opportunities for responders to find solace that they haven't been able to ask for elsewhere in prescription narcotics that then lead to theft or illicit drug use.
And while, this stuff can be marginally effective in the short term, it's important to recognize the long-term consequence and impact, both just in your general physiology, so your lack of sleep health and your lack of your own ability to sort of function without these drugs, but also when you're under the influence of a drug, you're making decisions that then will potentiate the challenges that you face. And it's another loop where we see the solution that we're trying to drive to make us feel better in the short term actually potentiates the problem in the long term.
And the risk for retention, holding a job, or suffering some consequence because you either performance or you do something that's against policy or whatever it may be is much higher than if not misuse.
And that last blurb here, people with post-traumatic stress injury are 2 to 4 times more likely to misuse substances than others. I think the reason's obvious. One, it's really challenging to self-diagnose post-traumatic stress injury. There's a lot of things you can attribute it to. And 2, it's just a desperate struggle for how can I hold it together? How can I continue to function? How can I not feel this pain? So lots of times in the past, we've looked through the lens of character flaw or weakness at substance misuse. Now is actually an opportunity for us to realize, hey, it seems like you're drinking a lot more. Seems like you've been showing up late for shift. What's going on? And to start an intelligent conversation that is not blaming, is not shaming. Which asks the question, how much alcohol is too much? I love this quote from Karen Jackson, a psychologist who works with a lot of fire departments in Colorado. Passing out is not the same thing as sleeping. This is another route to substance misuse. So many times, and we've all done it, or most of us have done it, you come home, you're tired and you're wired, you just want to self-regulate, so you grab a drink just to wind down, chill out. You can't go to sleep, your mind's racing, so you grab a drink to wind down, to chill out, to go to sleep. The problem is alcohol might make you fall asleep faster, but your sleep quality is vastly diminished. And oftentimes, because of the way that our sugar metabolizes, or our liver metabolizes the sugar in alcohol, we'll wake up several hours later with a precipitous drop in blood sugar that ironically triggers our sympathetic nervous system because it reads it as a state of distress. There is danger in our environment. So alcohol is not a good solution for improved sleep or to regulate our emotions and our stress.
We also consolidate memories and deal with stressful situations during the REM cycle of our sleep, and alcohol interferes our ability to get quality length of time in REM. So that's another sort of, again, a loop where we're using something that we sort of feel as is helping us cope, but the reality is it's potentiating the problem in the long term. And
again, speaking specific to alcohol, it's somewhat part of our culture and can be something that we do as a culture, as a group, as a team, as a squad, whatever it may be when we're off, and that could be part of the issue too.
Mm-hmm. And we've all seen the numbers that are really challenging to remember. For women, no more than 1 or 2 drinks a day. For men, no more than 3, no more than 9 per week for women, no more than 14 for men. You can't save them up and have a really good weekend. Yeah. But the real question isn't as much about how much you're drinking, it's about why you're drinking. And that's really easy to remember. Am I drinking to avoid thinking about something? Am I drinking to avoid feeling something? Am I drinking to try to regulate my nervous system? Have I given up other outlets for stress management? Do I have the ustas? I used to hang out with friends. I used to go mountain biking. I used to go hiking. I used to go to the gym. And now I just come home because I can't even and I grab a drink. Am I drinking alone? That's a big one. And a big question is it interfering with my life? Is my significant other upset with me? Have they mentioned it? Has my family mentioned it? Am I burning through my sick leave? Am I missing really important events? That's all a sign that, hey, maybe the use isn't therapeutic at this point, and it's something that needs to be addressed.
And Rhonda touched on it, but there's a tendency in our industry, because we recognize the difficulty when we do partake in particular alcohol, that if we have to be back on shift, depending on shift patterns, we tend to binge drink on the days that we're off. It's not unlike you would see in college students. When we're off duty is when we try to consume the most amount of alcohol.
And along the, Rhonda mentioned the number of drinks that are, maximum or appropriate. A drink is not a solo cup 2/3 of the way filled with vodka. A drink is 1.5 ounces of alcohol. So sit down and think about, what is how many drinks are in your drink before you actually do the math on whether you're consuming too much or not.
And for long-term health implications, we talked earlier about chronic stress increases the inflammatory response in the body. So does alcohol. Alcohol is a toxin. Small amounts socially, fine, but long-term chronic drinking just enhances some of the deleterious effects of chronic stress. Ironically, while most of us are trying to alleviate the impacts of chronic stress.
Before we get into resiliency, I just want to mention one thing on the topic of what I would consider maladaptive coping. So we covered drugs and alcohol, but there's a lot of other behaviors that are maladaptive. So there's sexual promiscuity, there's risk behavior, there are people that are jumping off and out of all kinds of various different things. In moderation and without, with the recognition that it's not something that's medicinal, it's great. But remember that all these different choices that you're making, if you're trying to mask feelings you have related to being exposed to trauma, that's maladaptive coping. And we want to have full-throated recognition of the fact that there's all these different choices that we make every day that are potentially because we were exposed to trauma.
Well, and just like we talked about, our supports can also be used as tools, and we're actually really good at weaponizing those against ourselves. Brandon makes a fantastic point. Excessive anything can be used to numb. And what's the definition of excessive? Excessive is when any activity or choice is taking up more of our time than it should, and it's forcing us to eliminate things that are really healthy. Our relationship with our family, our sleep, our workouts, whatever. And it doesn't have to be bad things, quote unquote. We can really justify, I need to mountain bike every day for 3 hours. Well, mountain biking itself is not bad, but if you're doing it to the exclusion of everything else, maybe it's worth looking at. Shopping, gambling, doom scrolling, being on the internet, just zoning out on our phones, super easy to do. but also another form of numbing. So there are a lot of things out there, and again, it goes back to this question, why am I doing this? Does it add value to my life, or is it really subtracting value from my life? So this has been our module on the physiology of stress and stress injury formation. We hope you enjoyed it. Please join us for our next module on resiliency, what it is and how to increase it in your life.